Respected Chairperson, Senior Faculty, dear delegates, I have been asked to speak on imaging of the degenerated lumbar spine. And my sequence of presentation will be, I'll be talking about the various imaging modalities available to us, and then I will discuss about the common spinal pathologies that are diagnosed on plain X-rays, MRI, and then I will discuss about the indications and need for CT scan in special situations. The three imaging modalities that are available to us are plain radiographs, MRI, and rarely we use the CT scan. Plain radiographs are the workhorse investigation that we use in our day-to-day practice. This includes an AP view and the lateral view of the lumbosacral spine. The first question that comes to our mind is, in this age of MRI, is there a need for plain radiographs? I will illustrate this example. This was one of our patients who had L4-5 stenosis, and we had planned for L4-5 decompression plus minus instrumentation. And then when we got the X-rays, we realized that there was a lysis sitting just below our L4-5 level. And this changed the complete treatment plan. So it is essential that we give and we get an X-ray of the lumbosacral spine in spite of having an MRI. The various pathologies that are commonly seen in the plain radiographs include a spondylolysis with listhesis, or degenerative listhesis. I am not going to discuss about these common pathologies. Some of the uncommon pathologies that we see in our practice is what is called as a vacuum phenomenon. This is a dark shadow that is seen in the disc space. This is a hallmark of advanced disc degeneration, and it happens due to nitrogen accumulation within the disc space. This is usually associated with segmental instability, and often when you find this vacuum disc, the disc affected level needs to be stabilized or fused. Lumbosacral transitional vertebra is another commonly found pathology. The prevalence is around 4 to 8%, and it is a common cause of low back pain in young adults. It is actually not in pathology, but a variation in the morphology of L5 and sacral vertebra. Castelvi et al. Gave a classification from type 1 to type 4, describing the various types. In the type 1, there is a hypertrophic transverse process of L5, and in type 4, the L5 and S1 are fused to each other with the transverse processes. And this condition, in which there is back pain in addition to lumbosacral transitional vertebra, is called as Bertolotti syndrome. In addition to the routine radiographs that we advise in our day-to-day practice, sometimes we need dynamic X-rays. This is basically a flexion and extension X-ray, and this can be done in standing position, sitting position, or in lateral decubitus position. The problems that we see on this dynamic X-ray is called the insertal instability, and this may be in the form of sagittal translation or angular instability. In addition to the segmental instability, we also need to assess the spinopelvic parameters. The three common parameters that we assess in our routine practice is the pelvic incidence, the pelvic tilt, and the sacral slope. The basic question that comes to our mind is, why do we need to measure these complex angular parameters for our degenerative pathologies? Various studies have shown that patients who have altered or increased pelvic incidence and pelvic tilt have a higher incidence of low back pain, and patients who have higher level of pelvic incidence and pelvic tilt have a generally poor outcome in spite of any surgical intervention. Hence, these parameters need to be measured and assessed to predict the outcome of any surgical intervention. The next common finding that we often see in our day-to-day practice is a degenerative scoliosis. And once we see this degenerative scoliosis on the X-ray, we must get an whole spine X-ray. This is nothing but a 36-inch X-ray film, and this can be done in supine as well as standing position. And on these films, we need to look for any subtle listhesis, rotatory subluxation, the presence of osteoporosis, and the loss of lumbar lordosis, in addition to assessment of the spinopelvic parameters. In addition to the spinopelvic parameters like pelvic incidence and pelvic tilt, sagittal balance is a very essential parameter that is altered in patients with degenerative scoliosis. Sagittal balance essentially means when you draw a plumb line from the C7 cervical vertebra, this should fall within the pelvis. But patients who are sagittally imbalanced, this plumb line falls ahead. So the back muscles have to work that much harder to keep you straight. And so patients who are sagittally imbalanced have a very poor quality of life due to mechanical back pain, and this must be corrected. So we have various softwares available like Surgimap, where you can measure the parameters, spinopelvic parameters, as well as the sagittal vertical axis, and have a plan for your management. One common question that is often asked, how do we differentiate between the adult onset degenerative scoliosis from the idiopathic scoliosis that has progressed to adulthood? And it's very essential that we know the difference. The adult idiopathic scoliosis is a scoliosis that is present in childhood and it is present now in adult. So these are usually thoracic with lumbar scoliosis. So this could be seen in even younger population. And these patients usually do not have spinal stenosis. Unlike the degenerative scoliosis, which is usually seen in older population, they have significant canal stenosis and the curve is not usually that big, and there could be sagittal imbalance in addition to the coronal imbalance. The next investigation that we need to assess is our MRI. MRI has become an important armamentarium in our hands for evaluating lumbar pathologies. The first step is getting a proper prescription for an MRI. We have to order the MRI of the part that we need to be imaged in detail, but in addition, we have to get the whole spine screening. So always ask for a screening MRI of the whole spine. Why so? Because this beautiful study from Ganga Hospital has shown that there could be other pathologies which could be lurking silently in the cervical and the dorsal spine, which could have an impact on the overall outcome. So we must order a whole spine screening. The disc degeneration is the most common pathology that we will come across in the lumbar spine. Furman et al. Have given a beautiful grading system for the disc degeneration. Normally, a young adult will have a bright, hyperintense annulus surrounded by the nucleus pulposus, and this differentiation is gradually lost with aging. So when you have grade 4 or grade 5, the disc looks homogeneously dark and the disc height may be reduced. So these patients who have degenerated disc will have higher incidence of back pain. Then coming to the disc prolapse. This prolapse is perhaps the most common pathology that we will come across. And we need to have used the proper nomenclature for describing this disc herniation. This could be either a central disc herniation or a paracentral disc herniation or a foraminal or an extraforaminal disc herniation, depending upon the location of the disc herniation with respect to the thecal sac. Another classification that is used with respect to the pedicle. The disc herniated could be either at the level of the pedicle, superior to the level of the pedicle, or at a higher level to the pedicle. But the most commonly used classification is this one, where we divide them into content disc herniation and non-content disc herniation. Again, the content disc herniation could be either broad-based or focal, and the focal disc herniation could be either a protrusion or an extrusion. In protruded disc herniation, the base of the herniation disc is wider than the apex, whereas in an extruded disc herniation, the base is narrower. So for example, this patient has an L4-5 disc herniation, but this is not the adequate description. So we should always tell that this is an L4-5 right paracentral broad base protruded disc. So this is how we should describe a disc herniation. Similarly, this is an L5S1 left-sided extraforaminal disc prolapse. Extraforaminal disc prolapse is far rarer to a canalicular disc herniation, but they are very painful and often a missed diagnosis. Patients who have recurrent disc prolapse, we can find it difficult to confirm the diagnosis on a routine MRI. In these patients, we need a contrast-enhanced MRI. Contrast-enhanced MRI, the presence of rim enhancement is classical of a recurrent disc herniation because patients could be having fibrous scar over there. The fibrous scar will homogeneously become hyperintense and contrast, whereas a recurrent disc will have only rim enhancement. Other things that can be seen on the MRI is facetal effusion. The facetal effusion is a telltale sign of instability, and this can be confirmed with dynamic X-rays. Facetal arthropathy can also be visualized on the MRI, and the presence of discs, the facet space narrowing, the presence of osteophytes or irregularity is a sign of facetal arthropathy. Facetal cysts can also masquerade as lumbar disc herniation and present with radiculopathy, but they look as an hyperintense signal coming out of the facetal joint. Lumbar canal stenosis can also be diagnosed on the MRI, and the classical lumbar canal stenosis happens because of the ligamentum flavum hypertrophy. The ligamentum flavum appears as a thin layer on the undersurface of the lamina. If it thickens, that we know that this is lumbar canal stenosis. The lumbar canal stenosis again can be classified depending upon the location of the stenosis. It can be a central canal stenosis or the far more common lateral recess stenosis and the rarer foraminal stenosis. Again, this has to be described based on the axial images. There has been a qualitative grading that has been described by Sijas et al. To explain the severity of lumbar canal stenosis, divided broadly into A, B, C, and D. A and B are categories where you can identify the individual nerve roots. And when you can identify the individual nerve roots, the plan is usually conservative. Whereas in type C and type D, you cannot make a differentiation of the individual nerve roots, and these are severe canal stenosis. And these are the patients who often land up with a surgical management. In patients who have multiple level lumbar canal stenosis, this qualitative Sijas grading also helps you determine the levels which need intervention. Often a question is asked, if we have already diagnosed spondylolisthesis at particular level, say at L4-5, do we need to get an MRI done? Yes, we also have to get an MRI done because there could be a concomitant stenosis at a higher level or at a lower level. And if you just address the listhetic level, the patient could still be symptomatic at the end of surgery. Then in degenerative scoliosis, MRI may be a little tricky because of the rotation involved, but we have to make an assessment of the foraminal stenosis, the presence of possible disc herniation, and the presence of facetal cyst. Modic changes are also a very important part that need to be assessed. Modic changes are nothing but vertebral body end plate signal changes. They are of three types: type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 and type 2 are the most common. Type 1 is usually a T1 hypointense, T2 hyperintense signal, and this usually implicates marrow edema or marrow inflammation. And these patients who have type 1 modic changes usually need some kind of stabilization or fusion surgery for management. Type 2 modic change is an age-related degenerative change in which there is T1 hyperintensity and T2 hyperintensity, and this usually signifies fatty replacement of the bone marrow. Sometimes the type 1 modic change may be confused with spondylodiscitis. The key step there is to look at the disc space. If the disc space looks hypointense or normal, that means it is a modic change. Whereas if the disc space looks bright on the T2 weighted images, this looks that probably there is an infection like spondylodiscitis. The last part that we need to discuss is the need for CT scan. In this today's day, when we get X-ray and an MRI, we get most of the information that we need to plan our treatment. But CT scan does have a role. For example, for delineating the pathology, like the presence of a calcified disc or an end plate eversion, or in certain cases, when you're planning a surgery, we need to understand the pedicle morphology or osteotomies, we need the CT scan. For example, in this case, we can see that there is a calcified disc. The presence of a calcified disc on the CT scan changes the whole treatment plan. We may not be able to do a simple discectomy, and we may have to do a fusion surgery because we have to curate the end plates that much. The presence of osteophytes also can be determined with the help of CT scan. These osteophytes could be in the form of traction osteophytes, they could be claw osteophyte, or they could be wraparound bumper osteophytes. These are better determined with the CT scan. The third and the most important role of CT scan is the evaluation of end plate failure. Earlier, we used to believe that majority of our disc herniation happened due to an annulus rupture, but now we know almost 65% of all lumbar disc herniation happen because of an end plate failure. And these end plate failures can be assessed, can be evaluated with a CT scan best. I think with this, we'll come to an end of our presentation. The take-home message from our presentation will be that multimodality approach will be the most helpful one. Plain radiographs still have a great role to play in the era of MRI. Dynamic radiographs help in evaluating subtle segmental instability. Qualitative MRI grading of lumbar canal stenosis helps plan treatment. Contrast enhanced MRI is useful for recurrent disc herniation, and CT scan helps identify disc calcification. Thank you.